Hello, this is John Majori with Majori on Bowie.com. And I'm here today with a very, very special guest, Bill Childs. And let me tell you who Bill is and why I invited him on. A few months after Bowie died in 2016, I read about a new cover album of his songs, and you can see the cover of the cover album behind me, by various artists aimed at children. And it's called Let All the Children Boogie, which is, of course, a line from Starman. That's before this blog existed, 2016. But I bought the album, listened to it, and initially thought, this isn't a children's album. It's just a collection of really good Bowie covers. And it became part of my rotation ever since. And I actually did review the album in 2018, the first year I started doing the blog. But I found myself listening to it again recently, and again thinking, this is a really good album. And I decided to reach out to Spare the Rock Records to see if I could get an interview with somebody involved with its creation, which is why I'm very happy to welcome Bill, who was one of the album's producers, owner of Spare the Rock Records, and the producer of a nationally syndicated radio show called Spare the Rock, Spoil the Child. So, Bill, thank you very much. Thank you for coming.
It's good to be here. Nice to be here, John. Thank you for inviting me.
So let me start with this. Spare the Rock isn't just a record company that just makes records. You make records for a particular purpose. Is that right?
Yeah, it's a thing like many things in my life that I sort of stumbled into doing. Back not long after the earthquake in Haiti, so whatever that is, 15 years ago or something like that, my friend Dean Jones, who's been a producer on all the records on the album, reached out. He was thinking about putting together a benefit album for Haiti relief for the Haitian People Support Project, and was just asking for help getting some introductions to artists. He's he produces all sorts of things, but he is best known and is a Grammy winner in the family music neighborhood. And so I said, well, that sounds like fun, but I've been kind of vaguely thinking about maybe starting a label. How about we work together on this? And he said, sure, that sounds great. And so the album that came from that was an album called Many Hands, Family Music for Haiti. And that has raised, I think it's close to $200,000 for the Haitian People Support Project now. And from there, well, 3 more times I've had the thought, hey, that's a good idea for an album. There's one more that have not yet done, but is in the back of my head thinking about. And this was one of those. So, so it's all been benefit CDs, all been family oriented. I think we'll talk about sort of to what extent this is a kid's record versus just a record. But that was the one that started it all. And so we've done 4 records, 3 physical releases, and 1 digital only release.
Yeah, and now this one was to benefit the It Gets Better Foundation. Is that correct?
That's right. It Gets Better Project is the name. I think they've changed their name to just It Gets Better now. But yes, and they do really amazing work for to try and help LGBTQ plus IA kids. And maybe we'll talk about that too. But yes, this is a benefit for It Gets Better. I don't remember what we're up to, $25,000 or $30,000 raised for them, something like that. So it's considerable funds for them.
That's great. And so when you had the idea for this album, was it initially to support It Gets Better, or did you have the idea for an album first, and then it just sort of the idea and the purpose married?
First, the idea was the album, and pretty quickly, the person I've worked with on all these records on sort of the promotion side is my friend Stephanie Mayers, who I think you've emailed with as well. Yeah. And together, we pretty quickly said, you know what especially early 2016, the right direction for this is helping queer kids, and pretty quickly, we looked at some different options, and It Gets Better was excited about it and ready to sort of partner up with it, and they've been a wonderful partner for it.
Yeah. So when Bowie was addressing issues having to do with sexual orientation and gender identity in the early 70s, he probably didn't have in mind that his work was going to resonate with young LGBT people 50 years later. But do you think that it did? Do you think that his work, his artistry, helped change attitudes that we live with today? That's characteristic of our world rather than the world of 50 years ago.
I think it did. I think that's right. I'm 53 years old, so as a kid when a lot of the work that you're talking about came out, and Ziggy Stardust and other things, I don't think. Well, one of the things that I think is really good about a lot of his stuff is that it isn't heavy-handed, it isn't didactic, it isn't saying, you should accept everybody, which I think is a fine thing to say, to be very clear, but it's not really a way, especially in the 70s and 80s, to convince people, and it's also not a particularly artistically interesting thing to do. And so I think, you've got the image from the cover behind you, which is sort of different eras of Bowie, and one of the things drawn by Jarek Krasaska, and one of the things that I think that did was help kids like me, and I'm a straight cis guy, but to growing up in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, and then moving up to Minnesota, to say, oh, there's a lots of different ways to be a person. There's lots of different ways to be male, and there's lots of different ways to be something that is broader than male, and to recognize that there's spectrums in a lot of those things without saying it out loud. It's subtextual rather than textual, and I think it's really powerful. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Well, yeah, I've talked to people that I'm 55, so I was also very young at the time, and but I've talked to people that worked with Bowie, and it seemed like he wasn't setting out to change political attitudes, but I do think that he did, whether intentionally or not, and I you know I I spoke to Tony Zanata, who worked with him at that time, and I said, and he who lives in New York City now, and I said, how do you feel walking around Manhattan and you can't not see the David Bowie that you knew from 50 years ago? He said it was wild, and he said that the people that were involved with making the music at the time, they thought they were doing something important, but they didn't think they were doing something political. But the other thing that and I don't mean to do the talking here, I want to hear from you, but
No,
the
no,
other
I'm
thing
curious.
I keep hearing is that fans appreciate Bowie because he let them be who they are. And again, I don't think that he set out, that wasn't necessarily his purpose, but that was the resonance of his message, whether he meant to or not.
Well,
That's
yeah, and I think the sort of obvious and probably almost cliched comp is Prince, right? Think of like moving up here to
yeah,
Minnesota. Very similar impact, I think, where it
yeah,
wasn't done. We just went and did the tour of Paisley Park not too long ago, and I don't think he thought of himself as a political actor. I think they both thought of themselves as artistic actors, but I think they both had tremendous impact, and maybe culturally, maybe is a better word than
yeah,
politically.
right.
And in terms of showing people, there's lots of different ways to be human, and there are lots of different ways to be amazing humans, and their artistry was just completely undeniable, which makes it impossible for them to be written off.
Yeah, yeah. So this album came out in 2016, which was the year that Bowie died, and it's a collection of 20 different songs by 20 different artists, which I have to imagine took some effort to pull together. Was it a coincidence of timing that it came out the year he died, or no?
I mean, and the thing that I don't remember exactly when in the year, you might know. I feel like it came out maybe in October, something like that, or maybe it was summertime. I feel like we might have just hit the deadline. Anyway, in any event, it wasn't until so he passed in January, I think. Is that right?
January, yes.
Yeah, yeah. So in March of that year, this is when I was still living in Austin, Texas, and well, I still do South by Southwest showcases every year, and that was the first year that what I did was a tribute show. It was at the Scottish Rite Theater, wonderful little theater, oldest still functioning stage in Austin, and had Charlie Sexton and a whole bunch of just amazing
Yeah.
artists coming out to do songs, to do David Bowie songs. And it was tremendously successful. Yahoo called it one of the 5 best things at South by that day. Got lots of good coverage. There's a line around the block, which is an Austin cliche, but a pretty good sign, right? And so it went really well. And I don't remember if I'd started thinking about doing an album already, but that was definitely the thing that made me say, okay, this is really going to work. And a lot of the artists, not all of them by any means, but a pretty good number of the artists on the album were people who played at that show. And but it was not a coincidence that it
Yeah.
was, I decided to switch the show to being a tribute to Bowie. It wasn't themed before that, after his death. And then because of that and kind of coming out of that, worked again with Stephanie and the other producers, Robert Burke Warren, who now does a wonderful Bowie tribute. I don't know if you've seen him.
I've
and
I've
details.
actually spoken with him. I have an interview with him. I
Oh,
live in, yeah, I live in Albany, New York, and
okay,
he
so up kind
played,
of near the Hudson Valley, yeah.
yeah, and he did his Bowie show in Albany, and I was fortunate to be able to interview him.
Yeah, so he's on this album. He's as Uncle Rock, and he was one of the producers of it as well.
I did
And
not know that.
yeah, because he was when I started doing the radio show, he had just started doing kids music as well. You know, he's this fascinating career,
Yeah,
starting off in a band with RuPaul, touring with the Fleshtones. Just really an amazing guy, really strong writer too. If you don't follow his newsletter. And pretty quickly, I realized, okay, for this one, this is a thing that I need to have Robert involved in, and he um, really helped us think it through.
yeah, no, that's terrific. I knew a couple of the artists, but not all of them. But they were all terrific. I mean, the one song is better than the next, which
Yeah.
is why I keep listening to it. But so it's an 8-year-old album, and Bowie died 8 years ago. But the interest in Bowie seems to be greater now than maybe than ever, or certainly more so than in the last say 30 years of his life. Why do you think that is, or do you make a different observation?
I believe you. I don't really have any reason to disagree. If I had to guess about why it's happening, I think there continues to be this interesting and concerning and sometimes exciting and wonderful uh, confluence of very strong views about how people should act, right?
Yeah,
And obviously that has become probably most pronounced in attacks on trans people.
yeah.
And I think, not to make this entirely about the cultural discussion, but I think that is part of it. And
Mhm.
then I think the other thing is there are, I haven't thought about this until just now, but I think I'm right to say that there are some really interesting artists today who you can draw pretty straight lines to. Chappell Roan, Billie Eilish. I'm certain that there's lots of others that I'm not thinking of, where you can say this doesn't exist without Bowie. Not to take anything away from those folks, because they're tremendously talented and creative and singular talents on their own. Um, but I suspect without knowing that people who go and see Chappell Roan are saying, well, what else is there like this?
Yeah.
Let's go learn about David Bowie. I realize you don't want to be the one talking, but I'm curious about what your view is on that. Like, obviously, you think that it is true. What do you think? What's the reason?
That is one of the topics that I've been exploring in my blog for since 2018.
Yeah,
I think everything that you said is right, and I just a couple other things. I think his lyrics give a lot to contemplate. They're not
true. Yep.
straightforward, and I think if you start getting interested in Bowie, there's really a lot to unpack. But also,
Well,
I suspect that because he changed his style so often, that you might approach the artist with a different set of values and find something there that you like, and then that leads you to something else. So unlike when he was alive, it all exists at once. So if you like Let's Dance, and that leads you to something like Black Star, you don't necessarily need to go through Tin Machine to get there. So,
yeah, it's an interesting point. Well, and the other thing that this just occurred to me too. I was reading. I was trying to remember the name of the Glass Spider tour for some reason. It was just
yeah,
blanking, and that was the only time I ever saw him play live. Was that tour? So I was 15 or 16 years old, something like that. And last night I went and saw Vampire Weekend in Minneapolis, and their current tour is much. I've only seen them a couple other times, and I guess they were probably festival shows, but very theatrical. Like
yeah,
at least in terms of the physical setup. Like they're still playing in a fairly straightforward way, but they had, I don't know, 3 or 4 different backdrops, one that would fall from the ceiling, and they had these very cool lights that were on like almost accordion things that would move up and down. I'd never seen that before. A very cool, big 3-dimensional backdrop. And I was thinking, when I was thinking back to what the Glass Spider tour was like, which I think was innovative in some senses anyway. I realized
yeah,
it wasn't entirely beloved. It was pretty cool for me as a 15 or 16-year-old kid to see as being just this really over the top thing with a huge spider and all the rest
yeah,
of it. And I wonder if some of the more theatrical shows that are happening now, I don't want to say Taylor Swift necessarily, but some of the other ones that are really telling a story and making all the rest of it. I wonder if that also to some extent goes back to him thinking about music as not just, and concerts as not just going out and playing songs.
Yeah, no, I think that you're spot on. And even before Glass Spider was the first time I saw him as well. But before that, he did the Diamond Dogs tour, which was literally 50 years ago,
Wow.
where he incorporated Broadway style sets. And that was really the precedent center, I think, where
Okay.
he wasn't just going out to play. But no, Glass Spider, I know you said it's not the most popular. It sometimes gets derided as a spectacle. Well, what a spectacle was! I mean, how
Yeah.
fun
What's
was
wrong with spectacle, man? There's a reason that the word spectacular is good.
it?
Right?
Yeah. So no, I think you're spot on. So going back to the album itself, I'm going to bring up a couple of songs in particular. But you got all these artists, and you said some of them were playing in Austin. What did you ask them to do? Some of their approaches are very different to covering Bowie. What were their instructions?
Yeah, I was trying to remember exactly what it was, and there very little. I mean, we had to make sure we didn't have repeats of songs, and there were a couple of artists, and I'm trying to remember, like Antibalas was one, and Barton Hill's choir. I had Golden Years in mind because I wanted them. Nakia, who's a friend of mine, and then I think Elizabeth Mitchell with Simi Stone were the one, and then Rhett Miller doing Ziggy Stardust. Those were the ones that we sort of picked out pretty early on. Said, okay, if we can get Rhett Miller to do Ziggy Stardust, because he'd been doing that for a while. If we can get these other ones, we sort of set those aside. And then there were some other names that we went to. I'm going to talk about song selection, and then I'll talk about the sort of rest of the direction. And then there were some other people where we went pretty like Ted Leo. I'm a huge Ted Leo fan, and said you could do almost anything, right, other than these four songs. And so he came back with Heroes, and then I'm trying to remember. He sent us another song that we never used because he just recorded too. And if I can find it, I'll send it to you. But we'll talk about Heroes later, I think. But I just love that version. And then the rest, it was like kind of going out and saying, "Tell us what you want to do. We'll tell you if it's still available."
Yeah.
And it worked out pretty well with some people choosing some pretty weird ones. I mean, a lot of these are pretty sort of well-known ones, of course, but like V2 Schneider is not a song I had ever heard of before. The Prettiest Star I don't remember hearing, and that turns out to be maybe my favorite song on the album.
Yeah.
In terms of how we asked them to do it, very little direction. These are all artists who have have their own approaches to things. We chose them because we thought they were interesting and creative and smart. And every so a few of them, I don't remember any of them in particular, would send us sort of demos and say, "Do you think this is the right direction?" And we might give them some ideas. And there were a couple of them where what we got wasn't quite there. And then Dean Jones, who's, like I said, a pretty amazing producer. So Dean did a little bit of tweaking of some stuff, but really what we got was pretty much there. We did very good, a lot of work with one of the things that I really love doing is sequencing albums, thinking about what order things go in. I'm really happy with how this came together. Alan Douches at West Side is the person who's done mastering for all of the records, and I before I had this label, I didn't really understand what mastering was, and now I understand that it's absolute freaking magic. Like what he can do to make like whatever it is, 19, 20 individual songs sound like a unified piece is just remarkable. So it was pretty hands off. We knew what Antibalas was going to sound like because Antibalas sounds like Antibalas. We kind of knew what Elizabeth Mitchell was going to sound like because Elizabeth Mitchell sounds like Elizabeth Mitchell, and so on and so forth. But there was a bunch of stuff that Colin Brooks had done almost no solo work before, didn't know what he was going to do. There were some at least a couple of pairings. Story Littleton, Marco Benevento, where Story at that time, she's Elizabeth Mitchell's daughter. Elizabeth Mitchell and Daniel Littleton are the band Ida. Story was just starting to do solo music. She's now a pretty successful solo artist. Didn't know what that was going to sound like. Gustav Yellow Gold and the Pop-Ups, that's two different kids bands that are not at bands that had worked together before and didn't really know what they were going to do. I think that version of Space Oddity is absolute genius. Unfortunately, Morgan Taylor, who is the Porcupine Gus Riello Gold passed away suddenly about 2 years ago, and every time I listen to that, I think, oh man, like it's so great, and it is also super emotional to think about him leaving, his wife and little kids and passing away. Anyway, I've rambled on a little bit there.
No, it's fascinating. It's I as I mentioned, the first time I listened to it, I didn't really hear it as a children's album, and I still think every single song stands up as really, really strong. But then as I was listening to it more, I started noticing some features of some of the songs that might have been geared more towards children. And you mentioned the Ted Leo version of Heroes. Ted Leo, I just not really relevant to this, but he was involved. He did a record with Amy Mann called The Both, which
Yeah.
is actually,
Oh yeah, great album.
yeah, it's one of my favorite non-Bowie albums, period.
Yeah.
So
No, that he said yes just blew my mind. Like I
yeah,
just love Ted Leo, and he said yes almost immediately, and it was a cold email. Like it's not. I didn't. Most of these people I knew somebody or knew somebody who knew somebody.
yeah,
And Ted, it was just like Stephanie emailed him, and he responded almost immediately. Yeah, I'm in.
yeah,
Great.
and it's and his version of Heroes, there's nothing particular about it that speaks to children other than the song itself is almost universal. But
Right.
it's such a great cover, and it's a very Heroes is one of the most covered Bowie songs, and so to really stand out, you have to do a special job, and I think he did. But then I noticed some of the other songs, like you mentioned V2 Schneider, which I think of as an inherently funny song to begin with. Even Bowie's version
Yeah.
it's almost tongue in cheek. So the artists that did that threw in some kazoos. So, but before I get too much into the individual songs, what makes a song a children's song? What makes this a project that's aimed for children?
Yeah, so I mean, it's an interesting question, and I'm not sure that this is a children's album, to be honest,
Yeah,
because there are certainly songs on here that I like. Kooks is a really good example, right?
yeah,
Where it solidly fits into being, even though it was not written as a children's song, a song that very well could be, and is very much sort of kid oriented, right?
right. Yeah,
Just because of what it is, right? Space Oddity, I think, kind of fits into that category as well. Um, but a lot of them are not. So what I think, so the radio show, Spare the Rock, Spoil the Child, I think of as we do, I don't know, I haven't done the math lately, but probably 2/3, 3/4 of the songs are songs that were made for children, and then the balance are songs that are not made for kids but are kid appropriate. So like I've been playing Kooks on the air for years, and some of these other songs as well. And most of the songs on this album kind of fit into that other category, and that other category often on the show are not songs that I think of as like, oh, this could have been released as a kid's song. It's just a kid appropriate song, because I think of the show and I think of this album to some extent as being sort of a bridge for kids into what they might listen to next. Like one of the things
yeah,
that I dislike most musically in the world is the kids pop songs, which are making or albums, which are making modern pop songs, many of which I think are great songs, into being kids songs by sort of cleaning up the lyrics. That doesn't make it a kids song, like any
right,
more than taking, I don't know, the sex scenes out of a Henry James novel would make it a kid's book, right?
right.
Like there should be, and I get a little bit didactic about this, but in the same way that it is good that we have children's books and books for young adults and books for, middle grades and all that, there should be music for each of those things, because the things that are going on in their brains are weird and specific and unique to them, and need to have songs that are attributed to them. And so like I love the Beatles. I played lots of the Beatles for my kids a lot. Love Bowie, played Bowie for my kids a lot. But when people say, "Oh, I don't like kids' music, I just listen to the Beatles," like, cool, but that isn't, and absolutely appropriate for part of the time, but that's not meeting your kids where they are. So more than I would say, really any of the other albums that I've put out, this is one that is sort of the farthest from really being a kid's album. It is kid appropriate. I mean, I've had a couple of complaints about like the Ziggy Stardust lyrics not being changed, and some other things, like whatever, fine. But I think it is
I noticed one lyric change in one song on this album.
yeah, and that's about it, right? And I mean, what I said on that front is it is the same thing I say when I'm booking bands for like South by Southwest for live shows. Like kid friendly there's a range of things that fall within that, right? And if I'm doing it on the radio, I'll probably be a little bit very slightly on the more conservative side than some people, but especially for live shows, like I think there's a wide range of things that are kid appropriate, and I think I stand by every song on here as being appropriate for kids. But parents can have different views, and that's fine. Knock yourself
Yeah.
out. Like I think there are probably parents who, because it's benefiting it gets better, don't want to support. Okay, fine. Like I think you're dumb, but that's fine. So
Yeah. I thought, when early on when I was listening to this, I thought the inclusion of Lady Stardust was potentially controversial, but getting back to the purpose of the album, it might really tie it together. So I also felt like this really lacks condescension. And I'm using that phrase as I think a phrase that you've used yourself, but
yeah,
it's really, you just said, I mean, it's meeting the children where they are. And how much of that was really part of the strategy of putting this together?
very intentional.
Yeah.
I mean, and no shade on. There's lots of people who doing music for kids and doing music and doing radio for kids for that matter. But I have always thought about the radio show as being like we're primarily on AAA stations, so like adult album alternative and then some
Yeah.
community stations. But I think of it like our flagship station is KUTX in Austin, which is a wonderful, amazing, very eclectic, very interesting radio station. And I want people who are listening to want to continue to listen whether or not they have kids. I want it to be good radio that happens to be for kids rather than being sort of condescending, and you're never gonna hear me talking in like a high-pitched voice like, hey kids, here we are.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which again, no shade to people who do that. That's just not the approach that I'm taking. And that has always been the case for the albums as well. And it's been successful. There's somebody, Secret Agent 23 Skidoo is a hip hop guy who's on the first album, the Many Hands release, and also on the Science Fair, the Girl Science Education album that I put out as well. And he talked about when I first came to him about Many Hands, which is brand new label, never done anything before. And he did a public post one time, and I've talked to him about it, about how he went to somebody he knew who was a longtime professional in music in general and in kids music, won Grammys, and talked to him about doing this. And that guy said, do it if you want to, but those albums never really raised any real money. Mostly it's there to make people feel good about themselves. And here we are, $250,000 later, or whatever it is, raised for Haitian People Support Project, $25,000, $30,000 for It Gets Better. I think that puts the lie to the notion that you have to be kiddie in order to be successful with kids.
Yeah.
And maybe it's not for all, the tagline for the radio show is indie music for indie kids. Maybe it's not for everybody. It's definitely not for people who really, really love kids bop. But that's okay.
Yeah.
Don't have to have everybody.
Let me ask you one last question about one of the songs that you alluded to, and then I'm going to ask you a question about the radio show. So you mentioned Colin Brooks. The song he chose was "I'll Follow You," which is in contention for the most obscure David Bowie song. In fact, I had never heard it before I heard his cover of it.
Same. Like,
Yeah.
I don't even remember how he came up with it. I'm trying to remember exactly. That was somebody who Elizabeth Mitchell introduced us to. I think he lives up in the Hudson Valley, or at least he did at the time. And he said he wanted to do it. I was like, cool, what is that? Never heard of that. Are you sure that's a David Bowie song?
Yeah.
And then I think it's a fantastic song. I think it came together really nicely. It hasn't made me say, oh, that's leaping up to be my favorite David Bowie song, but it's a song that I really love hearing on that album.
Yeah.
And I love, like, again, that, and I mean, maybe V2 Schneider is better known than I think of it as being, or The Prettiest Star for that matter. But I love the people who kind of went deep and
Yeah.
said, I'm gonna take something that people haven't heard, because there's some advantage if you're doing Heroes and everybody's heard it and everybody's heard it, they're familiar with it already, and you're not having to get them up to speed on that. When you have never heard "I'll Follow
Right.
You," that's a pretty good sign that you're going to have to do some work. And I think he pulls it off really well.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you very much. Let me just ask, as we wind down. We've talked about your radio show, and I know it's nationally syndicated. If somebody's watching this and is interested in listening to your radio show and doesn't know where to find it, how could they find where to listen to it?
Yeah, you can go to two different places, kutx.org. If you click on listen, they have the most recent show archived there of all the specialty shows, and you should do that, and you should listen to KUTX all the, like, when I get done with you, I will hit power on my stereo up here. It's what I stream every day, all day. Or you can go to sparetherock.com, which is the show for it, and you can stream going back, I don't know, 13 years on there because we're
Wow.
distributed by PRX, so there you can stream it on demand there. That's also, well, if you go to, what is it, letallthechildrenboogie.com, I think I should know that right off the top of my head. We'll get you to the site for the album, but you can also click on label at sparetherock.com and get information about all of the releases. And they're also all up on Bandcamp. I think sparetherockrecords.bandcamp.com.
Beautiful. Well, I hope more people get it because there's something in this album for certainly for every Bowie fan, including, like we just talked about, something that not everybody might know. So let me close with asking you a question I ask everybody, which is, what is your favorite Bowie song and album?
Yeah, I'm going to be a pretty cliched on both of, or pretty, maybe cliched isn't necessarily the word, but Heroes, I think, is now it.
Yeah,
And it wasn't until this album.
yeah,
And the Ted Leo version somehow sort of looped me around because you've heard it a million times,
right.
and it's unusual for me for like one of the most popular songs of a band to also be my favorite, just because it feels so familiar that you're not exactly bored with it, but it like seems like it should be. But something about Ted Leo's cover of it brought it back. I also really really love Sound and Vision.
Yeah.
So yeah. And then,
Beautiful.
and album probably Ziggy Stardust. I mean, it's such a complete work. And again, I'm pretty sure it was the first Bowie record I bought. I remember I still own a used vinyl copy of it that I got when I was probably 13 or 14. And it is hard, with that being sort of the introduction, other than, hearing Suffragette City on classic rock or whatever.
Yeah.
But that album as an introduction, it's hard to not have that be it. What's your answer to those questions?
Well, my favorite of his albums is Scary Monsters,
Sure.
and
Yep.
my favorite of his songs is not exactly obscure, but it's Beauty and the Beast, which is the first song off the Heroes album.
Yep.
If you were to ask me why, I don't know.
It's fair enough. Well, and Heroes was the album was in the mix. In this is I think probably attributable to my brother. Like Eno was a really big part of my teenage years. More like his solo stuff, and then I realized, oh crap, he also does like I hadn't recognized the connection. Everybody who is younger than you and I need to remember this is pre-internet. This is not
Yes.
where it wasn't necessarily like obvious and well known these connections. And when I go back to Heroes or other involved stuff, but it really captures me. So it's almost like the Replacements, which is probably my favorite band. Like my favorite Replacements album is the one that I'm listening to now.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, Bill, thank you very much. This has really been wonderful, and thank you for doing what you're doing, and certainly thank you for making this album happen. I really enjoyed this talk, and I look forward to listening to your radio show now. Thank
Thanks
you.
very much, John. I really enjoyed talking with you.